We talk LA Kings offseason moves with Austin Stanovich of the Hockey News on this edition of Locked On LA Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily podcast on the Los Angeles Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, Kings fans, welcome to Locked On LA Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for making Locked On LA Kings your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love for you to leave us a positive comment on Apple Podcasts if you're a fan of the show. And we're on YouTube. Please like and subscribe if you're enjoying this content. I'm Eddie Garcia, your host of Locked On LA Kings. I worked in sports media for the past 30 years, 20 plus years at the Fox Sports Radio Network. Also co-host of the Puck Podcast, a weekly NHL review show that's been putting out content for the past 18 years, and a passionate LA Kings fan for over 30 years. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Well, it is Wednesday. It's our usual day to have a special guest, and we like to bring people in to have different views, different opinions, different voices on what's going on with our LA Kings, and we're happy to be rejoined once again by friend of the show, Austin Stanovich of the Hockey News. He covers the LA Kings for them and is cranking out stories all the time. If you follow him on X and Twitter at @Stanovich68, you will get links to all of his latest stuff. Hey, Austin, how are you?
Good, Eddie. Like I said, I first jumped in. I always love coming on the show and talking Kings hockey with you, so I'm excited to be back.
Well, we appreciate your time and always enjoy your work. And we've got lots to talk about with the LA Kings. Obviously, it has been very busy over the last couple of weeks with the draft and free agency and development camp. So let's start off with this. I thought when the LA Kings made the Pierre-Luc Dubois move, that there was kind of a weight lifted off of the shoulders a little bit of the organization and the fan base, and that it had been settled where you kind of were on it one way or the other. He's no longer our problem, if you want to call it that. And now it's kind of like we can exhale and just move on with what the next step is. And then free agency came around, and I thought there was a lot of optimism. And then I thought the Kings were pretty underwhelming with what they did. What are your general thoughts on what the Kings did or didn't do in free agency?
Yeah, I mean, underwhelming, I think, is probably a good way to describe the fan reaction to free agency, certainly. I saw a lot of good opportunities to pick up some particularly top six forwards because it, to me, seemed like that's really what they needed. But then you see the contracts started rolling out, the term and the AAV that was getting given to some of these players, and I kind of understood why Rob Blake avoided some of them. I was big on bring in Steven Stamkos, let him, you clearly seem to be trying to make another run with Kopitar and Doughty, get Steven Stamkos in for 2 or 3 years, just commit to that, make that run, and then he signs a contract he does in Nashville, and you go, well, I kind of get you avoid that one. And that's kind of how I saw it continue to happen. And then you see the moves they do make with Warren Fogle and Joel Edmondson in particular, and however you feel about those moves, and I think most people, even myself, were a little, skeptical of that Joel Edmondson move, especially the contract. But what I will give Rob Blake certainly is that they clearly identified what they felt the issue was for this organization last season and addressed it. He said it very plainly, like the team, he used the term desire to win. They need to get more physical. They need to block more shots. They need to get harder in front of the net. They need to do all those things. They definitely did that with the guys they added. So whether you think that those guys are good enough, whether you think they're going to be the thing that gets the Kings over the line, I will certainly give Rob Blake and the front office credit that they set a goal, they had a plan, and they went out and they addressed it. And from that perspective, I think there is almost a successful element to free agency for the Kings. On the other side of it, particularly that Edmonson contract, that one's, I think, can age pretty poorly for a guy who already isn't maybe playing his best hockey, has some injury problems. You give him 4 years at that AAV, and that one's a little tough. But I also really like the Warren Fogle signing. I think that's a great pickup, and I like Tanner Jeannot, even if it was maybe a bit of an overpay to bring him in.
Yeah, I agree with you. The Edmonton one is really hard to swallow. And we've seen Rob Blake make some questionable signings. I mean, in hindsight, Cal Peterson, obviously, the big deal, and you invest so much in Pierre-Luc Dubois, a guy who has a questionable past. And now 4 years for a third pairing defenseman, we assume, right? And almost $4 million a year. I don't know any other team that's going to give him that deal. I would love to know what Rob Blake's thinking was on that. And if it was, hey, we really would like to have Joel Edmondson, but he says it's 4 years or nothing. I'm like, okay, sorry, I can't give you that. I just don't understand the term or frankly, the money per season. So another head scratcher for Rob Blake.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think the way I've described the Edmonton deal, almost in a similar way to the way I'd like to describe the Pierre Dubois deal, very different situations. But I think they looked at Joel Edmondson and they said, okay, we want a big physical stay-at-home defenseman to play with Clark or Spence on the third pair to kind of complement them. Joel Edmondson's our guy. And I go, in theory, like the idea of that sounds great, but the reality of Joel Edmondson is not this great shutdown stay-at-home defenseman. Like you look at his defensive numbers over the last couple of years and most of his career, it isn't very good. Like he's not a guy like Mikey Anderson who's suppressing shots and chances all the time, or one of these guys that's really difficult to play against for opposition forwards as far as trying to create offense. Like that isn't him. And I think they really fell in love with the idea of a Joel Edmondson while ignoring the reality of what he is, and then they overpay for it because of that.
I agree with you about Warren Fogle. I like him, and the contract is okay, but he seems like the type of guy you add when you've already got more. He's a complementary kind of a piece, and I thought the Kings needed a more of an impact kind of forward and a right-handed shot, and now they haven't addressed that, and there's really not much out there left. Is there any other moves they can make at this point as far as a trade or anything else that you see?
Yeah, I mean, the only trade option, I can kind of see is maybe they finally find a partner for Arthur Kaliev. I like the look of maybe trying to go after Oliver Wahlstrom in New York, a right-handed forward, a similar, I don't want to say necessarily a similar player, but a goal scorer like Arthur Kaliev. So there's some rhymes there. I do agree with your point that they needed a top six forward, and their biggest forward addition is Warren Fogle, which maybe is underwhelming from that perspective. But I also don't want to hold that against Warren Fogle. Like I think in isolation, that's still a really good pickup because he is that complementary player. Like you said, I mean, that's a guy that you can put because you have, in my opinion, some really good forward pairs up front. Like you can throw him anywhere with Kopitar and Kempe. We assume it's going to be Byfield and Fiala, Deneau and more. Like he can be a fit on all those lines. And I think having a guy with that kind of versatility, with that kind of speed and kind of physicality and everything, I think that's a really good piece for this team to have, even though, yes, they did need to add more than Warren Fogle. I hope for his sake he doesn't get, almost thrown under the bus because he was the big addition. And, that's not really his fault that Rob Blake only did that.
I saw one of your colleagues at the Hockey News floated out a trade possibility with Arthur Kaliev. We were talking Nick Robertson in Toronto, a couple of disgruntled guys, young guys swap for each other. I thought that made a lot of sense. He's not necessarily the top six forward you're looking for, but under the circumstances, it might not be a bad get in the circumstances of it because he's younger and maybe there's an upside to him.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we know the goal scoring talent is there with Robertson. He's had some injury issues, but I think if you can give him maybe more of an opportunity than he was going to get in Toronto, and the Kings have that opportunity, I think that's a really low risk, high reward kind of trade. The other one too is there's always the option to give Samuel Fagemo a real look in this lineup. I mean, this is a guy that's scored at a very impressive clip in the AHL, particularly last year, and we really haven't seen him get an extended look for the Kings. He's a guy that I think there's a group of young forwards that going into training camp this year, the message to them should be there is one top six spot and 3 or 4 other spots that you are all fighting for. Go take it. Go impress us and go take it. Kind of like what Gabe Velarde did a few seasons ago. He came in, the expectation was we don't know if this guy's going to be on the roster. If he starts out in the fourth line, and he came in and just blew everyone away in training camp. And I think that's what maybe a guy like Fagemo can do. Maybe if Arthur Kaliev is still here, maybe Arthur Kaliev can go do that. But Fagemo certainly would be the answer to that right-handed shot dilemma that they have. And I think that could be an option. I don't know how invested the Kings would be in that, but that's one that I personally would like kind of am keeping an eye on and seeing if maybe something develops there.
You talked about some of the younger players. We're going to talk more about them, including Quinton Byfield, who is still one of those younger guys, even though he's certainly more established. We'll do that here next on Locked On LA Kings, your team every day. Drive, passion, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive at eBay Motors. They've got everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's guaranteed fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the price you want, it is easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home the win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay's guaranteed fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, we've got more with Austin Stanovich. And Austin, you mentioned some of the younger players. Let's start with Quinton Byfield, who's the present and the future of the LA Kings. They may still need to sign him as a restricted free agent. And there's been talk of moving him to center this coming season. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the only way forward for this organization. I think it's clear now that their path to re-entering a cup contending window is through Quinton Byfield and also Brent Clark, but he's earlier in that development curve. But for Quinton Byfield, the time is now to start really handing over the reins to him. I mean, we saw there were stretches of last season where he was the Kings' best forward. There were stretches after Jim Hiller took over where if a line was struggling, the answer to get them going was putting Quinton Byfield on that line because of just how well he was playing. He's was taking over a huge role driving play and creating chances for that top line, even over guys like Kopitar and Kempe. They talked a lot about him deferring in that first season with those guys, and he really took on more of a leading role last season, which I think is good to see. And his defensive work for a guy at his age has been so impressive that it just makes sense to get him back to the middle. The only thing he's maybe missing is, we don't know how he's going to handle the faceoff circle next season, but that's, I think, a very easy thing to fix and something that should be low on the priority list for a guy like Quinton Byfield. Like he should start the season, in my opinion, as a 2C with a genuine path to become the number one center by the end of the season. I don't know if that's realistic or if the Kings view it that way. That's how I would view Quinton Byfield next season. This is the time to, you said the future and the present. I think the time is to make the future now and just start saying, hey, Q, this is your time to take over this team. I think that's how highly I view Quinton Byfield.
Well, that's interesting because the Kings, after making the big move to get Pierre-Luc Dubois, were unwilling to put him on the second line at center. But you think they would be willing to do it for Quinton Byfield?
Yeah, I think that I think a lot of that is also the fact that I think Quinton has kind of forced their hand in that situation. I think he's played so well that you can't deny what he is now, and you can't, with Pierre-Luc Dubois, I think, yes, there were some mistakes in his usage, but also he deserves plenty of that blame and not playing well enough to command that 2C spot. I think Byfield last season played well enough to command that spot at 2C, and Rob Blake kind of hinted over the summer that that's the plan, is to get him back to the middle. I wouldn't be surprised if he started, as a quote unquote 3C, but I think very quickly they need to move him up the lineup sheet, and he really needs to be the guy moving forward because, like I said, this franchise's future hinges entirely on Quinton Byfield emerging into the superstar they thought he could become at 2C or at second overall, and there's no point in delaying that process of getting into that point now.
Well, some of the other younger players who don't quite have Quinton's experience yet, certainly another high draft pick in Alex Turcotte and Nikhil Thomas. You mentioned Samuel Fogle as well. Be interesting to see if he gets the opportunity. When you look at some of the production the Kings have lost in the bottom six, Blake Lizotte, Carl Grundstrom, you feel confident Turcotte and Nikhil Thomas can match that production, hopefully exceed it, but at least match that production that the Kings lost in the bottom six?
Yeah, I think so. I think it'll be really interesting to see how they utilize guys like Thomas and Turcotte, because I think a lot of people have them penciled in onto that fourth line to start the season. And I get why. To me, those aren't fourth line players. Those aren't guys that I would want to see on a traditional fourth line. Maybe the Kings don't utilize a traditional fourth line. We'll kind of wait and see that. But I'd really like to see, kind of like I said, let them know, hey, there's this opportunity to take a really significant spot, and one of you needs to go out there in training camp and take it. Because I think that certainly Alex Turcotte could be a guy like at that LW1 next to Kopitar and Kempe. I think that would be a really good spot for Alex Turcotte if he can come in and take it. Akil Thomas, you kind of know what you're going to get with him every night. Like and to an extent, Turco too, like two really hardworking guys, maybe a little bit underrated skill at this point. With Thomas, I think he's maybe more suited for that 4C kind of role just because of how, how physically developed he is compared to a guy like Alex Turcotte. So I definitely think those two guys can replace what was lost in the fourth line, maybe even exceed it. Like I would put Tanner Jeannot down as a fourth line forward and then let one of Turcotte or Thomas take the top 9 role that Rob Blake kind of hinted at Jeannot having personally.
We know when Jim Hiller took over, he was in a situation where they were needing to secure a playoff spot. So maybe he wasn't allowed to, I don't know, do some of the things he would have liked to have done in the situation he was in. At the same time, we know he's not shy about moving people around, moving things around. We had Jim Fox on right after the end of the season and talked about Jim Hiller. And he said he thought it would take a couple of months for the team to really kind of figure it out under a new head coach, and maybe for the new head coach to kind of figure it out as well, which I don't know if they have 2 months of trying to figure it out if they're going to be a playoff team, but we'll talk about that later. Do you think Jim Hiller, do you feel like he's going to be a guy who's going to try and figure it out on the fly and see what the best combinations are? Or do you think he'll have a plan in place and let these guys get a chance to show if they're able to fit into that role or not before you start moving them around? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, no, I think that'll be one of the more fascinating things to see with Jim Hiller. Because like you said, we maybe didn't get a full view of what Jim Hiller can be because of the potential restraints that, like, he had one goal when he took over last season, that was to get this team back in the playoffs at any cost. Like there wasn't as much maybe flexibility for him to try things and become experimental. So seeing maybe, how long does he give, again, the first look we got at a potential top 9, Alex Ferrier on the top line. Does he give Alex Ferrier, hey, you get 20 games, we're going to give you a long leash here to prove you can, play this role? Or is he going to be really quick and a little bit cutthroat with it? Maybe like we saw when he took over last season because of that demand to immediately get results. So I'm really not sure, to be honest with you, from that perspective, how Jim Hiller is going to be. And I think that's going to be one of the most fascinating things to see is kind of how he handles now having a full off season, getting to implement more of his own ideas, not just taking what Todd McClellan had left over to keep things, more, to not try and make this wholesale change in the middle of the season. So I think seeing now what a true Jim Hiller team looks like and how Jim Hiller runs things when he has complete full control over a longer period of time is going to be the most fascinating thing about this season.
And we're all looking forward to seeing Brent Clark on a full-time basis there. Where do you think he fits in? Is he going to be with Gavrikov on the second pairing on the right side, or do you think Jordan Spence gets kind of the promotion, if you want to call it that, and they ease Clark in there on the bottom pairing with Joel Edmondson?
At the beginning of the season, like coming to training camp, I expect Clark to be next to Edmondson on that third pair. I think the most interesting thing is going to be what they do on the power play, because Jordan Spence, quarterback power play too, and he's a good player for that role. But I think you can't have Brent Clark on the lineup and not have him on a power play unit. You're just wasting his talent there. So that'll be a fascinating thing to me. I think that they clearly, with the limited usage Clark got last year, there was real concerns with his defensive play, and I think how he could physically handle the NHL. So I think that'll be the biggest thing for Clark to get that. Like if he can prove he can defend and he can deal with the physicality of the NHL very early on, I could easily see him moving up into that second pair role because of how talented he is. But to start the season, I think he's going to have to prove that he can handle those things and has made those improvements from the third pair.
All right, we've got more to talk about the LA Kings for the upcoming season, including our early thoughts on, do we think this team is a playoff team or not? That was the big question on yesterday's show. We'll talk about that and more here on Locked On LA Kings, your team every day. I do need to let you know that I love sports. I love them so much. I never want them to stop. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app, dream up a bet on anything that I'm in the mood for: baseball, golf, soccer, NASCAR. Never too early to bet on how your favorite NFL team is going to do for the upcoming season. And now that you know that, it is true that sports betting is not yet legal in California. However, you can still sign up at FanDuel, browse the latest betting odds on your favorite sports and teams on the Sportsbook app, and get in on the action from anywhere with their free games featuring real cash prizes. All summer long, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with boosts or bonus daily And there is always something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, we are wrapping it up with Austin Stanovich of the Hockey News. We haven't talked about goaltending. Your thoughts on Darcy Kuemper? I know when Cam Talbot came over, his numbers the previous year weren't great with Ottawa. Kemper's numbers with Washington weren't great. Can we see a similar kind of a turnaround for Darcy Kuemper with the Kings next season?
Yeah, I think we definitely can. And I think, a lot of people have talked about the potential to change systems in LA. And while I think there will be some changes, I do expect this to still be a very defense-first, defensive-minded team. And I think that will be a determining factor in how well Darcy Kuemper plays. Like, this has been a very goalie-friendly organization for quite a while now. And I think that kind of thing, not giving up a ton of high danger chances, not giving up a ton of second chances. We heard Cam Talbot talk about a big reason why he wanted to sign in LA last summer was to get the opportunity to play in front of a team like that. And for Darcy Kuemper, I think it can have a similar impact of really reinvigorating his career. And I think we're going to get into, can this team be a playoff team? I think it has to reinvigorate his career if this team's going to be a playoff team, because they will need him. They don't need him to be a Vezina candidate, but they need him to be, around what Cam Talbot was able to provide last year.
I know the Kings, and you mentioned it earlier, have talked about being tougher to play against, having a more physical element, going to the net, those kind of things. Were you among those that felt like that was something the Kings needed to address? And do you feel like Tanner Jeannot, Joel Edmondson are significant additions in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that was an element they needed. From day one, I've been saying to go after Jeannot really since his breakout in Nashville. I like what he brings. I like his game. Like I said earlier, the acquisition cost in that contract's maybe a little rich for my blood with Jeannot, but he definitely fills that role. He definitely fills that need, and I think he does it very well. Fogle, again, pretty big, fast. He's physical. Edmonson, for all of his faults, is going to give you a really physical, honest game. So purely looking at, did they address this thing that, in my opinion, was absolutely a need? I think they've gotten pushed around too much in the playoffs these last couple of years. I do think Rob Blake deserves a lot of credit for really going out and addressing that and finding an answer to it.
So if the Kings are to be a playoff team again, what do you see as 2 or 3 keys that have to hit for the Kings for next season?
I think that one big key is going to be Quinton Byfield, who we talked about earlier. I think they need him to really take the next step and prove he can be that, probably even 60-plus point center that we all, I think he can be, or at least I know I do, and I think you think that as well. Like, I think he needs to really take that step. We can't see regression from certain guys like Kopitar and Doughty are the ones that I think everyone, maybe not everyone, but that I certainly have concerns about because of their age, because they're getting a little bit on. Like, you always have to worry a little bit that that regression is coming on the horizon, and just worry about when is that going to happen. That can't be next season. Trevor Moore, can he be a 30-goal guy again? If he takes a big step back in scoring, that could be problematic. So those two things. And the big one for me is, what I think their plan is for the forward group, which is to have the pairs that I kind of mentioned earlier, Kopitar, Kempe, Fiala, QB, and then Danault and Moore, be complemented by these hardworking kind of physical guys like your Laferrières, your Jeannots, your Fogles. Like, in an article I wrote, I liken it to having to a meal, like, they have their filet mignon and lobster for surf and turf with those pairs of players, and then the guys like Jeannot and Fogle and Laferrière are kind of your mashed potatoes and veggies type of thing, right? Like, they're not super fancy, they're not what gets you up off your seat, but they kind of tie everything together. And I think how well that works in practice is going to be a key determining factor, because on paper that top 9 to me looks a little underwhelming for a playoff team. But if it works how I think the Kings want it to work, it could be a formula that's better than the sum of its parts and really lead to a lot of success for the Kings. I think whether or not that works is a huge key.
Well, I think it'll be pretty shocking if the Kings were to finish top 2 in the Pacific. It's certainly, at best case scenario, you're thinking 3rd place wild card.
Yeah.
I look at the Kings. I don't think it would be, water into wine for them to be a playoff team, but I also could see them missing the playoffs as well. I really think they're a bubble team at this point. You're shaking your head for people watching on YouTube. Yeah. You would agree with that, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're obviously behind Vancouver and Edmonton in the Pacific. And then I think in the Pacific, it comes down to them, Vegas, and Seattle for me, who I think could be a sneaky good team next season. I think they've made some big acquisitions. I've been, since his draft year, a pretty big proponent of Shane Wright. I really like his game, and I think he could have a bigger impact than people are thinking next season on that team. And obviously, they still have Matty Beniers, who I don't want to say had a sophomore slump last season because he's still a good player, but like if he takes even another step, that's a really, really good piece for that team to have. So I think in Vegas and Seattle, would it shock me if one of those teams was better than the Kings next year and had more points than them? Not at all. And then you're looking at fighting for a wild card spot against a very, very good Central Division, in my opinion. And that's where it starts to get, I think, concerning for the Kings. And I would agree that definitely a bubble team. There's just a lot of what ifs for me. If a lot of those what ifs hit in a good way, I think this Kings team will be very easily third place in the Pacific and kind of cruise into the playoffs in that spot. But if some of those what ifs go the other direction, I think the Kings, those things like Moore and Kopitar have a regression. The guys like Jeannot or Laferriere don't really fit as top 9 pieces. Like if those things happen, Kuemper really can't bounce back even in front of a good D. Like he really struggles. Those are all things that if one or multiple of those things happen, I could see the Kings missing the playoffs, even if at this moment in time, my gut tells me they probably still squeak in.
Hey, real quick before we let you go, any thoughts on the Kings 2024 draft class?
Yeah, I mean, I really liked it. Obviously, it was a limited, only 4 picks. I like what I have seen from Liam Greentree. I think there's a lot of upside in that player. Obviously, a big winger. I think there's a lot of work to do with his skating and the consistency in his compete level, but he's a young kid with a ton of skill, and I always love taking a big swing on a player with that much skill because if he hits, he is a legitimate top 6 center in the NHL. Like I always say with goalies, Carter George in the second. Goaltending is its own beast. I won't pretend to know a ton about it. I just know the kid. My favorite scouting report I saw is the mental foundations is that of a starter, the physical foundations is that of a backup. So, whatever that means to someone, I think it's a safe bet in a world where most teams have a 1A, 1B. So even if he's not a true starter, if he can be like a good 30, 35 game goalie a season, great pick in the second round. And then the 6th and 7th round picks, like I'm not gonna act like I've seen a ton of these guys. And statistically speaking, those guys probably won't make it. But I like taking a big swing on that big defenseman in the 6th round. So overall, generally speaking, I'm a fan of what Mark Yannetti does, and I think he does a very good job drafting. I think he's done so again this year.
That is Austin Stanovich. He covers the LA Kings, and he does a great job for the Hockey News. Again, follow him on X, Twitter, at @AStanovich68. He's cranking out stories at least every other day, if not more. Appreciate it, Austin. I always appreciate your enthusiasm coming on the show. Great getting your thoughts. Really appreciate it, and looking forward to doing it again before we get going. But thanks for doing this today.
Yeah, of course, anytime. Like I said, I love coming on here and talking Kings hockey with you.
All right, appreciate it. Again, that is Austin Stanovich, and we are always appreciative when he gives us a little bit of his time. Hope you guys enjoyed that as well. For you everydayers, those who listen and watch Locked On LA Kings every day, don't forget on Friday, as usual, it's our fan feedback show. Again, so much to talk about with the LA Kings and everything that's been going on with them. If you want to send an email for that, the email address is lockedoneddie, EDDIE, at gmail.com. And we'd love you to stay interactive with the show on social media, X, Twitter, and Instagram. We are at Locked On LA Kings. I'm Eddie Garcia. Thanks for listening and watching this episode of Locked On LA Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Have a great rest of your day. We'll talk to you tomorrow. And as always, go Kings, go.